Hello everyone, I'm McKenzie-Jackson. I'm a 19-year-old British climate activist living in America at the moment. I've been part of Fridays for Future since 15 years old, organising climate strikes across the world, as well as Extinction Rebellion youth, and now I am working on art to be able to antagonise society to think about why we need environmental justice. Growing up, I've always been very involved within environmental rights. I think that's because I grew up vegetarian. My parents always taught me about animal rights, and that's probably where my activism stems from. It isn't necessarily climate justice at all, but the right for all living beings on this earth. And growing up, doing my own research, not from school unfortunately, I started to learn more about how the intersections between animal rights and agriculture connects to climate change. And I started to become quite frustrated, scared, and sad about where our planet's got to and why I was never told about it before or informed in a way which I felt like I could feel empowered enough to make a change. So I found that really difficult actually. I think I was probably 11 or 12, and then I took those emotions and turned them into action, because I think it's really important to acknowledge everyone has a voice. It's just feeling empowered enough to use that voice. I never had any idea what my campaigning would lead to, and I think that's probably why it got so big, was because my intention was purely to make a change. And I think that's why it's really important to be talking on these stages. It's all about intent. Why are we all here? What are we all talking about? And how can we work together to create change? I grew up quite differently. I had two mums and I was vegetarian with a twin sister, so not a nuclear family, which was, I really, really value it because I grew up in a holistic way, which I think made me think outside of the box. But I remember my parents used to get books, children's books for me, which would normalise like me being a vegetarian. There was one called Herb the Vegetarian Dragon, and I remember it, and it's still my favourite book. And it's about this dragon who's a herbivore instead of a meat eater, and it's talking about why he was that. And I think it framed it in a really good way, especially because I was a boy as well, kind of doing it in a way which made being kind to the environment still acceptable within the dominance of masculinity. I had a book about these two mums going to space with their children. It just made it really normal. And I think that's why children media is very impactful, is because it's part of primary socialisation. It's to do with your parents and then to do with the media you take in the first 3 to 4 years of your life. So it's about making sure we normalise and like build those connections and those sparks about environmental change, and about just thinking outside the box and challenging all the status quos to make sure that we are aiming to bring the next generation up equipped enough to be able to fight this crisis, which has unfortunately occurred due to the inaction of other previous generations. Climate change is the biggest crisis the world has ever faced and probably will ever face. And that's a really big statement. It's quite hard to say, I think, because I've had no part of it and I haven't had a say or participation in what my future will look like. And that is the same for the generation growing up who will be taking in the media you guys make, right? So, knowing that that is their future and knowing that the script has been written for them, it's really important to enable them to be able to rewrite the script, to be able to feel empowered enough to use that voice they have. And that's why I'm so privileged to be able to grow up in a holistic way and taught about these things when I was younger, because now I feel empowered enough to create a change and I know the script can change. But I don't think many people are given the resources or the headspace to be able to think like that. And I think that is up to you guys. That is up to the many institutions who put information in our heads at quite a young age. That's their responsibility. We see greenwashing tactics from these mass corporations. Greenwashing is a technique which mass corporations use to deceive the public into thinking that everything is okay and their businesses are doing all they can to be environmentally friendly. Like, we can see Shell and BP, these massive fossil fuel companies, using solar panels and green landscapes in their ads, which gives the notion that they're doing all they can for the environment when they're doing the opposite. They are funding and they're bringing so much oil and gas out of the world. It's basically a death sentence for millions and millions of people in the global south and for future generations to come. So you guys have the exact same influence for younger people. It's really important that you don't fall down the trap of deceiving people and you really tell the truth in a way which will empower instead of flatten and make people feel hopeless. I don't think children's media should necessarily label content as environmentally conscious or as gender conscious, because I think that should run parallel on every single thing you guys make. I think it's important. When I enter any meeting or when I enter any interview, I always think about what is my intent in entering this space? Why am I here? What am I trying to achieve? And I think you guys should be doing the same thing. Why are you in this room today? What do you want to achieve by the role you have? And then it should all come down to creating positive change. And if it doesn't, then you're in the wrong place and you should leave the room and give the space up to someone else who's willing to do the right thing. So I think it does just come down to being as pure as possible in the way in which you create content. And it also is about, what would you want your children to watch? What would you have wanted to watch when you were younger? You can think like that as well, because with time, the climate crisis will only get worse. So how are you guys going to stay parallel with the climate crisis getting worse with your content, educating young people on this matter? So I have clinically diagnosed depression since 15 years old. That was after finding out and doing my research about climate change. And I think one of the biggest culprits responsible for me feeling so hopeless is the media, because I was never equipped and I wasn't able to learn about what was happening to our world in a way which socialized me into knowing that I had power. When you grow up, especially when you enter those teenage years, the world completely changes and your perspective shifts. And I think if we don't acknowledge that in the content we make, and if we don't realize that we are inevitably going to find out about climate change, about racial issues, about homophobia, why don't we teach children about it in a constructive way which will enable change from a young age, instead of leaving them to do their own research, spiraling into this really, really dark hole of not knowing what they're doing and not knowing how they create change and feeling lied to by the world. I think everyone should feel really guilty if they don't take responsibility for that and if they don't try and fix that mistake you guys have continued to make. It's not just about giving a voice. I think, of course, airing a subject is really important, but it's about linking the dots. It's about showing that climate change does actually link to your everyday life, and homophobia does link to how you perceive love. It's about making sure that all of these justices we're fighting for right now, and all of the traction for social issues and environmental issues, are parallel within all the work. I've said this before. I think there's a really problematic sense of having an environmental department or having a focus on one particular thing during a particular time or an episode, because it makes it look like after that's done you can write it off, when that's not true. The climate crisis will always be bad and will only get worse if we don't do anything now, and that's across everything. It doesn't stop when an episode stops. It will continue. So the work you guys should be doing should always continue as well. I think our role is about socializing children into becoming good humans, into becoming humans who care about the planet and care about each other and put love first. Storytelling's been around forever, and it's the way we've created change in the past, from Jews using art in concentration camps to tell their story to cavemen on walls. We've seen art really shape how society is today. And this is no different to that. It's about harnessing creativity and creating change.